June 1944. Saipan fell to American forces. The message arrived like a stone thrown into a dark pond, and every ripple hit the highest table in Tokyo. Saipan has fallen. In the War Ministry office, the gramophone hissed, and the electric fan seemed louder for a second. Papers lay splayed on the desk, the telegram creased and trembling in an aide's hand. The room went silent. When the telegram was read aloud, three truths struck them like thunder. The defensive ring was broken. Enemy airfields now lay within reach, and the civilian population on the home islands was suddenly exposed. One commander stood up and left the room without a word. What did they say when they heard Saipan had been taken, and why did that moment change everything for a nation already at war? The tone that followed was equal parts dread and calculation. Inside the War Ministry, the microscena was stark and ritualized. It was June, but the sun through the blinds made the wood grain look bleached and brittle. General Tanaka sat behind a lacquered desk, the varnish catching the light. Around him were Admiral Sato, Colonel Fujimori, Captain Nakamura, and Lieutenant Ito, names that would be repeated in reports and whispered in civilian kitchens. A map of the Pacific was tacked to the wall, pins and strings showing positions and ranges. The telegram smelled faintly of smoke and machine oil. Men wiped their palms on their trousers, a tentative, repetitive gesture like the ticking of a clock. Papers rustled. A teacup cracked slightly when someone set it down too hard. Silence was a presence in itself. Outside, in the courtyard, a messenger boy called out the hour, and the sound seemed to come from a different world. The ritual of protocol demanded calm. Instead, someone, a junior aide named Hayashi, coughed and then cleared his throat, as if to claim permission to speak about what the numbers meant. The revelation was technical, and it was simple. Saipan sat roughly 1,500 miles from Tokyo, a number that turned strategy into catastrophe. One enemy airfield on that island meant bombers within operational reach, short of refueling, and with fighters to escort them. The report listed aircraft range figures, sortie tempos, and the logistics of repair and replenishment. A single calculation showed the defensive posture they had trusted for years could not sustain attacks. The report used the words reach and payload and sortie rate with the cold precision of a ledger. A map showed concentric circles from Saipan, labeled with flight times and probable targets, the imperial capital among them. That figure of 1,500 miles was not abstract. It translated into flight hours over the sea, into fuel estimates, into the time window for air raid warnings, or lack of them. The technical appendix ended with a line that read like a verdict, a line about vulnerable civilian centers and evacuation capacity. For a brief moment, the military language gave way to images of roofs, aflame and trains packed with refugees. If protocol was a rigid script, the next minutes tore it up. Admiral Sato slammed his palm on a map and said, "What do you propose we tell the public?" General Tanaka answered, "We hold the line." Captain Nakamura said, "But the line is within reach now." Lieutenant Ito spoke faster, "We must consider evacuation routes for Tokyo and Yokohama." Colonel Fujimori looked at the telegram and then at his colleagues and said, "The propaganda machine cannot learn this tomorrow." Their words came out clipped, the voice of men trained to ration breath for orders. Dialogue followed as policy and panic collided. Hayashi interrupted, "Sir, if I may, there is a report from the Civil Defense Bureau." Sato barked, "Read it." Hayashi read numbers of shelters and capacity and then paused because the numbers did not add up. The room smelled of cigarette smoke and old paper and overcooked tea. One by one, the men revealed small betrayals of composure, a hand that trembled when reaching for a cup, a throat cleared to hide a sob. The conversation swelled into argument as 10 voices circled around the same truth, and the exchanges grew sharper. There were 5 to 6 distinct turns in this exchange, enough to show how decisions twisted and remade themselves. In that rupture, a junior aide suggested breaking protocol and informing civilians. The suggestion was met with stunned silence, and then with the old calculus of morale versus survival. The ethical conflict arrived as a choice between preserving national pride and preserving human lives. The minister Hasegawa entered the room, his shoes clicking on the polished floor, his face pale under the gaslight. He had been elected on a platform that had used propaganda to stiffen resolve. Now he confronted the numbers, and a compact backstory began to matter. Hasegawa had grown up in a provincial town devastated by floods. He had promised his mother that he would never allow citizens to be abandoned to the elements. That childhood oath had driven him into public service, a path that hardened into pragmatism and later into a willingness to sacrifice truth for unity. That backstory explains why he hesitated now, torn between the machinery of image and the memory of a family that could not be saved by slogans alone. His hesitation lasted only a moment, but it was long enough for more voices to argue the consequences. A historian in the room suggested that admitting the truth would trigger panic and refugee flows. A civil defense officer called Miyazaki warned that evacuation plans assumed warnings of 6 hours, not the shortened windows implied by the new enemy reach. The dialogue here moved from theoretical to immediate. There were 4 to 6 exchanges, layered with rising tension, and each line carried sensory detail: the clink of a medal removed from a lapel, the scrape of a chair leg on wood, the metallic tang of worry on an officer's tongue. Ethical crucible. They weighed renunciation of pride against the chance to save civilians. At about this point in the narrative, pause for a moment and imagine standing in that cabinet room for 1 minute. If you were there, would you act to preserve order or to warn the people who might be hit next? Share your thought in the comments, starting with A, my choice is, so we can highlight different perspectives. Your answers help others see how fragile decisions were, and they shape future episodes we might produce. If you value analysis and human detail, join the conversation below and tell us which consequence described here you think mattered most. Your reflections guide the next topics we explore, and each week we pick comments to discuss on air. Now back to the room where protocol cracked and the first public choices were being formed. The measures they took were uneasy and immediate. A preliminary bulletin was drafted that used euphemism and omission while signaling readiness. They decided to reinforce coastal anti-aircraft batteries and to order a limited evacuation of military families from the nearest vulnerable prefectures. The word evacuation appeared in a line that none of them wanted to shout in a press conference. They sent a confidential report to the Emperor's Secretariat and debated whether to demand an unconditional stand or to prepare for negotiated pauses. Names circulated in memos: the commander of the Eastern Fleet, Admiral Saito, the head of civil defense, Miyazaki, the Home Affairs Minister, Kuroda, the Foreign Minister, Aoki, all added layers of opinion, and all made public posture more complicated. In the city streets, civilians were still listening to radio broadcasts and noticing the altered cadence of official statements. Rumors began to move faster than dispatches. Refugees started to leave coastal towns on their own accord, long lines forming at train stations with mattresses and kettles and the smell of boiled rice heavy in the air. The first small convoys of military families boarded trains labeled with stenciled destination codes, and children held stuffed animals tight against chests. The ministry ordered blackouts in certain districts and tested air raid sirens that sounded thin and unfamiliar to ears unaccustomed to their warning. These immediate consequences carried both administrative and human weight and pointed toward a larger unraveling. The weeks that followed turned calculation into calamity. Bombardment, reconnaissance, and reply led to rounds of telegrams and reports that alternately reassured and terrified. The press adapted language in stages, from denial to euphemism to blunt announcement, and propaganda clashed with lived experience on the streets.
There were casualties among port workers and an increase in displaced persons as refugees streamed inward to supposedly safer inland shelters. The term bombardeo appeared in dispatches months later, describing raids that had been enabled in part by that single lost island. Political fallout reached into the highest offices, and calls for accountability mounted from newspapers and the Diet. Some officials offered renuncia as a means to absorb blame.
Hasegawa considered stepping down, and in private told a trusted aide, "If I leave the post, maybe the country will move forward." The aide replied, "Or perhaps the truth will be buried." Their exchange hinted at the tension between symbolic sacrifice and effective leadership. In the epilogue, the human ledger was laid out. The capture of Saipan did not by itself determine the end, but it changed the calculus dramatically. Within months, fleets were rerouted, cities prepared for raids, and millions felt the dislocation of war more keenly. Evacuation orders proved insufficient to prevent suffering, and many civilians became refugees in their own land. The reports that historians read later were full of numbers, sorties, tonnage, casualties. But behind every statistic was a family with a name, a stove gone cold, a child who would not see summer. If there is a final lesson, it is this: governments may spin narratives, but distances and capabilities speak in plain figures, and those figures can no longer be softened by propaganda. If this account moved you, subscribe to follow our series where documents and personal testimony meet to explain turning points. The truth, even when delayed, alters the course of lives and nations.